Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Tidelift Upstream. My name is Val Karpov, and today I'm going to talk about what I wish I knew when I became an open source maintainer. Just give me a second to share my screen. So first of all, let's start off with a little bit about me. I've been the maintainer of Mongoose, which they tell me is the most downloaded database framework for Node.js since 2014. Um, it's an ODM for Node and MongoDB. I also do a lot of JavaScript tech blogging on masteringJS.io and thecodebarbarian.com. I've been a part of several successful early stage startups, but I recently switched full time to working on open source and tech blogging. So I'm going to talk about how I got into open source and what I learned from the 4 different phases I went through as maintainer of Mongoose. I started working on Mongoose as a kind of a part-time responsibility as part of a full-time job. I then switched to working as a maintainer as my full-time job at MongoDB. I then moved to working at a company that didn't use Mongoose at all and working on Mongoose on the side. And finally, I switched to working on Mongoose effectively full-time. So first, let's talk about how I got into open source. Not unlike in many other people or many other developers in open source, I just got started using Mongoose. I started tinkering with Mongoose. I started putting in PRs to improve Mongoose, and then all of a sudden I started maintaining Mongoose and barely knew what happened. So let's see. When I took over as maintainer, I was taking the air train to JFK Airport in New York. Just scrolling through Twitter to pass the time, I saw this tweet from the previous maintainer of Mongoose and couldn't reply fast enough. And before I knew it, I took over as maintainer of Mongoose. I had commit and push access by the time I got back to New York. So I convinced my then employer to work about 1 to 2 days a week on Mongoose. In hindsight, the changeover process didn't was happened really quickly with very little communication, both between me and the previous maintainer and between me and the users of Mongoose. I tried to kind of push out the maintainer change via Twitter and via my blog, but not everybody reads that. So the lesson here is that open source changes very fast. So maintainers of open source projects change rapidly and often without any real oversight. So in my case, taking over Mongoose worked out pretty well. But on the other hand, it could have just as easily gone badly. So not every maintainer change is going to go well. And one of the things that Tidelift does well is tracking who's maintaining a particular project and what happens when someone changes maintainers. So in my experience, most open source maintainers or maintainer changeovers go off without a hitch. But given how many companies rely on open source software, there's definitely an incentive for bad actors to abuse the system. The classic example was in 2018, a popular open source project called Upstream, which not very many people in Node depend on directly, but it's an upstream dependency of Webpack and several other very popular projects. So a malicious user became the maintainer of this project and pushed a bunch of code that was designed to steal API keys for Bitcoin wallets. Given that Tidelift is responsible for tracking who's maintaining a project, this is something that Tidelift could have well, maybe if not at least prevented, at least helped get a solution out faster. So in 2016, I made the switch to working full-time on Mongoose at MongoDB. I was technically on the MongoDB node driver team, but mostly working on Mongoose with some occasional contributions to the node driver. And this was a great accomplishment for me. I felt like I just won the lottery. Getting to work on my own project full time was awesome, but in reality, it came with a few trade-offs. Much of the reason why I managed to negotiate this working on Mongoose full time was the support load was just too much for 1 to 2 days a week. I was getting dozens of issue reports every week, and there was no way I was just going to get through them in 2 days. So thing to remember here is that even though open source software is free, it's still a product, and with maintaining a product comes the unglamorous responsibility of customer support. For example, the TypeScript repo averages about 20 new issues a day. This is community supported TypeScript bindings with 53,000 issues reported. Mongoose doesn't get quite as many, but we just recently crossed 10,000 GitHub issues. And well, given that the project's been open for only about 10 years, that averages to 1,000 issues a month or a year, and 3 issues per day since the project started. These days, we probably end up getting more like 5 or 6 issue reports per day. So not quite as active as TypeScript, but on the other hand, we're also not backed by Microsoft. So worth mentioning, GitHub issue templates are one of the best things that's ever happened to open source maintainers. Please use them when they're available. Filling them out may seem a little tedious. It feels like filling out a form. But on the other hand, open source maintainers really don't have context into your project, and any extra context that you can provide can help make sure that your issue is resolved quickly and with minimum back and forth. So in 2016, I left MongoDB and joined a small startup based out of the Bay Area. They used MongoDB and Node.js, but at the time we were using Strong Loop's loopback framework, which was kind of not exactly a competitor to Mongoose, but a similar and related project that helped you work with Node.js and MongoDB. So despite the fact that I was no longer using Mongoose at my full-time job, I kept working on Mongoose. Again, I love Mongoose. It's a wonderful project, and I felt responsible for making sure that the project continued and kept on being successful. So there was no way I was going to leave it, and the choices worked out pretty well. Mongoose grew rapidly. Mongoose's download numbers grew rapidly. Booster grew rapidly, and they proved to have a mutually beneficial relationship. Issues that I fixed in Mongoose often ended up being related to issues that I needed to fix at the startup, and lessons that I learned from the startup about running Node.js and MongoDB in production ended up feeding back into Mongoose. So Mongoose and the startup both benefited from each other because learnings from one project I could apply to the other and vice versa. So as Mongoose grew, I found myself wondering whether I could work on Mongoose full time without having a full time job, and the answer wasn't clear. I think one of the biggest problems is that many open source developers end up working on open source because of the kind of like upper circle of the famous Ikigai chart, where Ikigai is basically a four-way. Let's see here. Kind of like a four-way Venn chart or Venn diagram between what you're good at, what you love, what the world needs, and what you can get paid for. Open source ends up often being an intersection of what you're good at, what you love, and what the world needs, and the getting paid for is the tricky part. So again, I started working on Mongoose because it was a fun project to work on. I like tinkering on code. I'm more than happy to spend 8 hours a day sitting in front of a computer screen staring at code and optimizing weird JavaScript quirks. But things like building a business plan or DMing potential customers on LinkedIn are way out of my comfort zone, unfortunately. So business development, sales, they're definitely not my strong suit. That's why I'm in engineering, not in sales. And that's why I find, well, in my experience at least, that's why a lot of open source projects struggle with finding funding is we're not really geared towards being a business plan or we're not really geared towards being a business. We're geared towards working on something that we love. But you know, despite all the reasons why working on Mongoose full time might not work, I think this year I'm going to give it an honest shot. So wish me luck. A lot of obstacles to overcome, lots to learn, but I'm confident we can. We'll see. Well, I'm confident we can do it. Let's put it that way. And I wouldn't have had the ability to try this without help. Again, I've been fortunate to have lots of great organizations help me out. Tidelift, started working with Tidelift in 2018. They've been very helpful. One of our Mongoose power users, Mixmax, they're an email automation company based out of San Francisco, forced us to start an open collective. That's worked out well for us as well, and a bunch of others. And going out and meeting people that use Mongoose was really what set the foundation for going full time. Like when I lived in the Bay Area, I would be up in San Francisco attending tech meetups several times a month. And then when I moved to Miami, one of the first things I did was reach out to the local coding boot camp. They're called WinCode. I guess they recently got acquired. But yeah, and I started working with them, helping them out. Pretty soon they ended up switching their curriculum to Node.js with my help. So the lesson here is you can and should build relationships with maintainers of open source projects that you rely on. Again, open source developers are often friendly people that are very eager to help. And I'm very thankful for all the great people I've met over the years working on Mongoose. Some of my most fond memories of working on Mongoose are spending time with some teams out in the San Francisco Bay Area, like let's see, Localize, Ethos, Mixmax. I've given talks at their offices, given workshops, met up with the execs for drinks, things like that. So building a relationship just helped me get a better sense of how these teams operate and kind of what they need, and it helps us iterate through issues faster. So by building productive professional relationships, we can make open source work better for everyone and help each other out. So one bonus lesson. Although open source does change fast, I did mention that as my first lesson. I think stability is something that can be a very key benefit of open source projects, and not necessarily just because you can just fork whatever version of the code you want and start tinker with it as you want. I've gone through quite a few changes in my life in the 7+ years that I've been working on Mongoose. And I changed jobs twice. When I first started working on Mongoose, I lived in New York, and then I moved across the country twice, first to San Francisco and then to Miami. I met a girl, got married, bought a house, made some friends, lost some old friends. A lot of people, jobs, locations, they've all come and gone. But in spite of all those changes, I've been able to keep putting my best foot forward with Mongoose for over 7 years, and well, there's no reason why that I can see that that's going to change anytime soon. So I think having a maintainer that can stick around regardless of major life changes is one of the key benefits of open source. So that's all I have for today. Thank you very much for listening, and time for questions.